Kyle Peterson slammed his coffee cup down on the kitchen table. "If that dog barks one more time, I swear I'm going out there to see what in the world is so important." His wife, Emily, sighed as she leaned against the counter, watching their golden retriever, Daisy, standing at the edge of the yard, barking her head off at the empty field behind their house. It had been going on for 3 days straight. Every morning, right around sunrise, Daisy would rush outside, plant herself in the same spot, and start barking furiously at nothing but tall grass and wind. "She's never acted like this before," Emily said, crossing her arms. "Something's got her spooked." Kyle rubbed his temples and stood up. "I'm not about to let this dog drive me insane. If there's something out there, I'm going to find out what it is." He pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was crisp, the sky tinged with orange as the sun began its slow climb. Daisy turned her head toward him, her tail wagging slightly, but she didn't stop barking. As soon as Kyle took a step off the porch, she ran back toward the field, her nose low to the ground, sniffing frantically. "All right, girl, show me what's got you all worked up," Kyle muttered, walking toward her. Emily followed, wrapping a cardigan around herself as she trailed behind him. Their 10-year-old son, Tyler, peeked out the back door, curious but cautious. "Is Daisy okay?" Tyler called out. "We're about to find out," Emily answered. Daisy circled a spot in the field, whining now, digging at the dirt with her front paws. Kyle frowned and crouched beside her, brushing away some of the loose earth. Something wasn't right. The ground felt too soft in that spot, as if it had been disturbed recently. He exchanged a glance with Emily, then dug in with both hands. "Kyle," Emily whispered, her voice laced with unease. "What is that?" His fingers hit something solid. Something wooden. Tyler came running out of the house now, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "Dad, what is it? What's buried there?" Kyle didn't answer right away. He was too busy trying to pull out whatever was hidden beneath the dirt. Daisy kept whining, pacing back and forth, as if urging him to hurry. Then, with a final tug, Kyle unearthed a small wooden box. It was old, its edges worn smooth, its surface covered in dirt. "Should we open it?" Emily asked, hesitantly. Kyle looked at Daisy, who had stopped barking and was now sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on the box as if she already knew what was inside. "I think we have to," Kyle said, his voice low. He lifted the lid, and inside, nestled in faded cloth, was a collection of photographs, letters, and a small, delicate locket. Emily gasped, picking up the topmost picture. It was black and white, showing a young woman standing in front of a familiar house. Their house. "Who is she?" Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kyle scanned the letters, his brow furrowing. "These date back to the 1940s, he murmured. "This box must have been buried here for decades." Emily pulled out the locket and carefully opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a soldier in uniform. She ran her fingers over the image, her expression softening. "It looks like a love story," she said, her eyes misting over. "Someone buried this here a long time ago. Maybe they never got the chance to come back for it." Tyler glanced at Daisy, who was wagging her tail now, her job seemingly done. "Do you think she knew? That this was here?" Kyle let out a slow breath, looking at their dog with newfound appreciation. "I don't know how, but she must have." Emily nodded, carefully placing the contents back into the box. "We should try to find out who this belonged to," she said. "Maybe there's family out there who never knew this existed." Kyle looked at his wife, then at Tyler, who was still staring in wonder at the box. He exhaled, nodding. Looks like we've got a mystery to solve. As they headed back toward the house, the morning sun cast long golden rays over the field. Daisy trotted beside them, her tail wagging happily. It seemed she had done exactly what she was meant to do. Now, it was up to them to uncover the rest of the story. Emily sat at the kitchen table with the wooden box in front of her, the old photographs and letters spread out like puzzle pieces waiting to be put together. The locket rested in her palm, its tiny clasp still functional despite its age. She could hardly believe what they had found. Daisy lay at her feet, her golden fur warm against Emily's leg. The dog was calm now, her mission seemingly accomplished, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Kyle returned from the office with a notepad in hand. "All right," he said, sitting down across from her. "Let's go through what we have. If we're going to figure out who this belonged to, we need to be methodical." Tyler, who had been pacing the kitchen in excitement, plopped into the seat next to his mom. "Can we start with the letters? Maybe they have names or addresses." Emily carefully unfolded one of the letters, the paper delicate and slightly yellowed. The handwriting was neat, the ink faded but still legible. "My dearest Margaret," she read aloud. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of you. The war keeps me far away, but your love is my anchor, my guiding star. I promise, when this is all over, I will come home to you, and we will finally have the life we dreamed of. Until then, keep me in your heart as I keep you in mine. Forever yours, William." She looked up, her heart aching for the unknown couple. This is someone's love story, someone who lived here before us. "Margaret and William," Kyle murmured, writing the names down. "We need to figure out if they ever got their happy ending." Tyler grabbed one of the photographs. "Do you think this is her? Margaret?" He held up the image of the young woman standing in front of the house, her smile bright, her dress billowing slightly in the wind. The house behind her looked exactly the same as theirs, except for a few minor details. An old porch swing that was no longer there, a different shade of paint. "It has to be," Emily said. "And if this house belonged to her, then maybe there's a way to trace her history." Kyle tapped his notepad. "Property records. We can check the county archives and see who owned this land back in the 1940s. If Margaret lived here, there might be some record of her." Tyler leaned forward, his excitement growing. "Can we go tomorrow? I want to know what happened to them." Emily smiled at her son's enthusiasm. "We'll go first thing in the morning." That night, Emily lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the locket still in her hand. She couldn't stop thinking about Margaret and William. Had he made it home? Had they gotten the life they dreamed of? Or had fate been cruel? The question swirled in her mind until she drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, after dropping Tyler off at school, Kyle and Emily drove to the county records office. The building was old but well kept, its walls lined with shelves filled with dusty ledgers and documents. An elderly clerk greeted them warmly and listened patiently as Kyle explained their request. "You're looking for property records from the 1940s?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Give me a moment. I believe we have records going back that far." She disappeared into the back room, and Emily tapped her fingers anxiously on the counter. Daisy's barking had led them to something incredible, but they still didn't know why. After a few minutes, the clerk returned with a thick ledger. "Here we are. This property was owned by a Margaret Townsend in 1942. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "That's her." Kyle leaned closer. "Does it say what happened to her? Did she sell the house?" The clerk flipped through the pages. "It looks like she kept the house until 1944, Then there's a sale record. The new owners purchased it in June of that year. Emily frowned. 1944? That was during the war. Kyle exhaled. If she sold the house, it might mean maybe William didn't make it home? The thought filled Emily with a deep sadness. She glanced at the letters and photographs they had brought with them, a love story frozen in time. We need to find out more, Kyle said. If William was in the war, there could be military records. Maybe an obituary if he didn't come back. The clerk nodded. The local library has old newspapers on microfilm. That might be a good place to check. Emily thanked her, and they left the office with more questions than answers. The library was only a short drive away, and they wasted no time diving into the archives. The librarian helped them access the microfilm records, and Kyle scrolled through old newspapers, scanning headlines for anything related to William Townsend. Then he found it. "Emily," he whispered, "look at this." She leaned over his shoulder and read the small, heartbreaking notice printed in a 1944 edition of the local paper. William Townsend, sergeant in the United States Army, reported missing in action as of April 1944. Emily's throat tightened. Missing in action. That means they never found him. Kyle exhaled slowly. If he never came home, Margaret might have sold the house because she couldn't bear to live here alone anymore. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of history pressing down on them. Emily gently touched the locket she had worn around her neck since finding it, the tiny photo of William inside suddenly feeling so much heavier. She buried this box, Emily said softly. Maybe she thought one day he'd come back and find it. Kyle nodded. But he never did. Emily wiped at her eyes. We need to do something. We need to find out if Margaret had family, if there's anyone still alive who should have this. Kyle squeezed her hand. Then that's our next step. We find Margaret's family. Daisy had led them to this mystery, but now it was up to them to finish the story. And Emily was more determined than ever to make sure that Margaret and William were not forgotten. Kyle sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old locket as it rested beside the scattered photographs. Emily stood at the counter, brewing coffee, her mind racing through the possibilities of what they would do next. The weight of history was on them now. A love story unfinished, waiting for its final pages to be written. Tyler bounded into the kitchen, full of energy. So, are we going to find Margaret's family today? He asked excitedly. Emily nodded. That's the plan, but we need a solid lead first. Kyle tapped his fingers on the table. We know she sold the house in 1944. If we can track where she moved, we might find her family. Tyler sat down next to his father. Can't we just look up her name online? That's a good place to start, Emily agreed. She opened her laptop and typed Margaret Townsend, 1944 into a search engine. Pages of results popped up, but nothing immediately useful. We need to narrow this down. If she moved away, there might be a census record. Kyle nodded. We should check genealogical websites. Maybe an obituary or marriage record. If she got married again, she might have changed her last name. They spent the next hour combing through records, searching for any trace of Margaret. Tyler fidgeted in his chair, occasionally peeking at Daisy, who lay near the back door, her ears twitching as if still attuned to something unseen. Finally, Emily let out a breath. I found something. A Margaret Townsend married a man named Richard Caldwell in 1947. The marriage certificate lists her as a widow. Kyle ran a hand through his hair. So she really did think William was gone for good. Emily clicked through more records. They moved to a town about 2 hours from here. She lived there until she passed away in 1998. That's recent, Kyle said. Maybe she had kids, grandkids. Emily scrolled further. She had 2 sons, Daniel and Thomas Caldwell. One of them might still be alive. Tyler leaned forward. We should go talk to them. They need to know about this. Kyle hesitated. We can't just show up at their door. We need to be careful about how we approach this. Emily agreed. Let's see if we can find a phone number first. If we explain what we found, maybe they'll want to meet. After another hour of searching, they found a phone number for Daniel Caldwell. Emily hesitated before dialing, her heart pounding. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. Hello? Hi, is this Daniel Caldwell? She asked. Speaking. Who's this? Emily took a breath. My name is Emily Peterson. I live in the house that your mother once owned back in the 1940s. We recently found something buried on the property, something that I believe belonged to her. There was a pause on the other end. My mother's old house? What exactly did you find? A box, Emily said, filled with letters, photographs, and a locket with a picture of a man named William Townsend. We believe he was your mother's first love. Daniel was silent for a moment, then sighed. I've heard the name before. My mother spoke about him when I was younger. She always said he was lost in the war, but she never mentioned a box. Emily glanced at Kyle and Tyler. Would you be willing to meet us? I think you should see this. Daniel hesitated before finally saying, I suppose I should. Where are you? They arranged to meet at a small cafe in town the next day. When Emily hung up the phone, her hands were shaking. He's willing to see us. Kyle squeezed her hand. Then we tell him the story, and we give him back what belongs to his family. The next morning, they arrived at the cafe early, the box carefully wrapped in a cloth bag. Daisy, sensing the importance of the moment, sat obediently beside Kyle's feet as they waited. Daniel arrived right on time. He was in his 70s, tall and slightly stooped, with gray hair and kind eyes. He shook hands with Kyle and Emily before sitting down. So, he said, tell me about this box. Emily carefully placed it on the table and lifted the lid. She handed him the letter addressed to Margaret, the words written so many decades ago now resting in her son's hands. Daniel read silently for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. I had no idea she kept these. She never spoke about him in detail, just that he was lost, and that she had loved him. Kyle pulled out the photograph of Margaret standing in front of their house. This is your mother. We found this in the box, too. Daniel chuckled softly. She was so young here. I never saw this picture before. Then Emily handed him the locket. When he opened it and saw William's face inside, he let out a deep breath. So this is him, the man she never forgot. Tyler, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. Do you think she ever stopped loving him? Daniel smiled sadly. I think a part of her always did. My father, Richard, was a good man. He loved her, and she loved him too. But there was always something in her eyes when she talked about the past. I think she kept this buried because she couldn't bear to part with it, but she also couldn't keep it with her. Emily wiped away a tear. We didn't want this to stay hidden forever. We wanted it to go back to the family it belonged to, and Daniel nodded. I appreciate that. This means more than you know. He sat with them for a while longer, telling stories about his mother, about her strength and kindness. By the time they left, Emily felt lighter, as if a weight had lifted. The box had found its way home, and Margaret and William's story had finally been told. As they drove back, Tyler reached over to scratch Daisy's head. "You were right all along, girl. You knew something important was out there." Daisy wagged her tail, satisfied. Her job was done, but the journey had changed all of them forever. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere beyond time, Margaret and William were finally at peace. As they pulled into the driveway, Tyler was still buzzing with excitement. "I can't believe we actually met Margaret's son. It's like we walked into a history book." Emily smiled as she unbuckled her seatbelt. "It does feel that way, doesn't it? We learned so much about her, about William. But I still feel like there's more to the story." Kyle opened the back door for Daisy, who leaped out and immediately trotted toward the field where they had first found the buried box. She sniffed around, her tail wagging, as if the job wasn't quite finished yet. Emily watched her for a moment, then turned to Kyle. "I keep wondering, if Margaret buried that box, did she ever come back to look for it? Or did she bury something else?" Kyle raised an eyebrow. "You think there could be more?" "I don't know, but I have a feeling Daisy wouldn't be so fixated on that spot unless there was something else out there." Tyler's eyes widened. "Let's check. We can dig a little more and see if there's anything else hidden." Kyle hesitated, then sighed, knowing there was no way around it. "All right, I'll grab the shovels." They walked back to the field, the sun casting long shadows as it began to sink toward the horizon. Daisy bounded ahead, stopping at the very same place where the box had been buried. She sniffed at the ground, then pawed at it, whining softly. Emily took that as a sign. "Let's dig here again. Maybe there's more to this mystery." Kyle started digging, shoveling away the dirt, while Tyler knelt beside him, eager to help. Emily stood back, hands on her hips, watching carefully. It wasn't long before Kyle's shovel hit something solid again. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, setting the shovel aside and kneeling down to brush the dirt away. This time, the object was larger, a rusted metal box, slightly dented, but still intact. He carefully pried the lid open, and inside, wrapped in brittle fabric, were several more envelopes, an old journal, and what looked like a folded-up map. Tyler's face lit up. "This is amazing! What if it's another part of their story?" Emily picked up the journal, handling it carefully. It must be Margaret's. If she buried this separately from the other box, there must be a reason. Kyle dusted off the map and unfolded it. It was faded, but detailed, with several locations marked in ink. "I think this shows places that were important to her. Maybe places she shared with William." Tyler leaned in. "Look, there's a star next to a name, Willow Creek. Isn't that near where Daniel said she moved?" Emily nodded. "Yes, it's about an hour away." Kyle exhaled. "So what now? We take a trip to Willow Creek?" Emily met his gaze. "I think we have to. If Margaret left something there, something she wanted to keep hidden, we need to find out why." Tyler pumped his fist. "Road trip," Kyle chuckled. "All right, but we do this carefully. We don't know what we'll find." The next morning, after a quick breakfast, they packed up and set out for Willow Creek. The drive was peaceful, the road winding through open countryside, past fields of golden wheat and clusters of old oak trees. Daisy sat in the back seat, her ears perked up, as if she knew they were on an important mission. When they arrived, they found Willow Creek to be a quiet town, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. A small main street with a diner, a general store, and a few shops gave it a timeless charm. Emily pulled out the map and studied it. The spot she marked looks like it's near the old church at the edge of town. They drove through the narrow streets until they reached the church, a white, wooden building with a weathered steeple. A small cemetery stretched out behind it, and beyond that, a wooded area that looked undisturbed. Daisy whined as soon as they stepped out of the car, her nose twitching. She pulled at her leash, leading them toward the trees. "I think she knows something's here," Tyler whispered. Emily tightened her grip on the journal. "Let's follow her." They walked through the tall grass, guided by Daisy's eager nose. The trees cast dappled shadows across the ground, and the air smelled of pine and earth. It wasn't long before Daisy stopped abruptly, pawing at the ground just as she had before. Kyle knelt down and pushed away the leaves and dirt, his heart pounding. If there's something buried here, this has to be the last piece of the puzzle. He dug carefully, his fingers brushing against something hard. Another small box, this time made of tin, rested just beneath the surface. He pulled it free and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was another letter, along with an old black and white photograph. Emily picked up the letter, her voice shaking as she read, "My dearest William, if you ever find this, know that I never stopped waiting for you. If you made it home, I prayed you would come back to find me. If you didn't, then let this letter be proof that my love for you never wavered. I kept our memories safe, hidden where no one else would find them. If you're reading this, you have found the last piece of my heart. With love forever, Margaret." Silence filled the woods. The weight of Margaret's words pressed on them all. Tyler's voice was quiet. She never gave up on him. Kyle held the photograph up to the light. It was of Margaret, sitting on the steps of the very church they stood beside, gazing at the horizon as if waiting for someone to return. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. She left this here for him, hoping he'd find it. Kyle let out a deep breath. But he never did. Emily gently closed the box. "Margaret's story isn't forgotten. We found what she left behind. We can make sure her love for William isn't lost." Tyler nodded. "We should bring this back to Daniel. He deserves to know." Kyle stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Let's go home. We have a story to finish." As they made their way back to the car, Daisy trotted beside them, her tail wagging. She had led them to the truth. And now, finally, they understood what she had been trying to show them all along. As they drove back home, the weight of the discovery settled over them. The box, now resting safely in Emily's lap, felt like more than just an artifact. It was a love story that had waited decades to be told. Tyler leaned against the window, deep in thought. Do you think William ever even made it home? What if he came back and never knew where to look? Kyle gripped the wheel a little tighter. It's possible. Missing in action doesn't always mean gone forever. Some soldiers made it home years later. Emily sighed. That's what we need to find out. The moment they got back, Emily wasted no time diving into research. The name William Townsend was common, but she narrowed the search to military records from the 1940s. She scrolled through lists of reported missing soldiers, scanning each one carefully. Then she found something. Kyle, come look at this, she said, her voice filled with urgency. Kyle pulled a chair up beside her. On the screen was a military record dated 1945. William Townsend, reported missing in action but not declared dead. Instead, there was a later update. Found alive in 1950, recovered from a military hospital in France. He survived? Tyler gasped, peering over their shoulders. Emily's eyes widened. But if he survived, why didn't he come back? Why didn't he find Margaret? Kyle shook his head. If he was in a military hospital for years, he might have lost his memory. Some soldiers never regained full recollection of their past. He could have spent the rest of his life not knowing who he was. Emily clicked through more documents, searching for anything that might indicate what had happened to William after he was found. After several minutes of digging, she found an immigration record from 1952. He was relocated to New York. That's not far from here, she murmured. Tyler sat up straight. Does that mean he could still be alive? Emily hesitated. Possibly, but he'd be very old now. The last record of him is from the 1970s. We need to see if there's any trace of him after that. Kyle rubbed his chin. We need to find out if he had family. If he never found Margaret again, he might have started over with someone else. They spent hours combing through archives, tracing records, until finally they found something that made Emily's breath hitch. William Townsend passed away in 1981, she read aloud, her voice soft. Buried in a cemetery in Albany, New York. Silence settled over them. So he never made it back to her, Tyler whispered. Emily nodded. No, he didn't. But that doesn't mean his story is over. We need to go to Albany. Kyle nodded. If we find his grave, we might find answers. Maybe he left behind something that tells his side of the story. Tyler looked at Daisy, who lay by the door, tail slowly wagging, as if she knew they weren't done yet. And maybe she'll lead us to something else. The next morning, they packed a few essentials and set out for Albany. The drive was long, but the anticipation kept them alert. When they arrived at the cemetery, Emily's heart pounded. Rows upon rows of gravestones stretched out before them, each one marking a life, a story, a love that had once existed. Kyle approached the caretaker's office. We're looking for a grave. William Townsend. Do you have records for him? The caretaker, an elderly man with kind eyes, nodded. William Townsend. Yes, I remember that one. Row 12, lot 34. They thanked him and walked in the direction he had pointed. As they moved through the rows, Emily clutched the locket in her hand. When they reached the grave, Tyler was the first to notice something unusual. Look at this, he said, pointing. Someone's been visiting. Fresh flowers had been placed at the foot of the grave. A small, folded note lay beside them. Emily bent down, carefully picking up the note and unfolding it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. For the man I never got to know, I hope you found happiness, wherever life took you. Kyle exhaled. Someone else has been looking for him too. Emily studied the grave. We need to find out who left this note. If there's family, they deserve to know about Margaret. They deserve to know everything. As they stood in front of the grave, Daisy sat down beside them, as if waiting for the next clue. The mystery wasn't over yet. They had come this far, and now they had one more trail to follow. Emily stared at the note, her fingers tightening around the edges as a breeze stirred the air. She looked at Kyle, then at Tyler, who was shifting restlessly on his feet. Someone else has been searching for him, she murmured. Someone who cared. Tyler crouched beside Daisy, rubbing her back. But who? And how do we find them? Kyle took a deep breath, hands on his hips as he scanned the cemetery. We start with the caretaker. If someone's been visiting this grave, he might have seen them. They made their way back to the small caretaker's office near the entrance. The old man looked up from his desk, setting aside a newspaper. Back so soon? Emily placed the note on the counter. Do you know who's been leaving flowers on William Townsend's grave? The caretaker adjusted his glasses, glancing at the handwriting. I do, actually. Young woman, probably in her late 20s or early 30s. She comes by every few months, always quiet, always leaves flowers and a note. Emily's pulse quickened. Do you know her name? He nodded. Lillian Townsend. She told me once she was looking for family history. Said she found out late in life that William was her grandfather. Tyler's eyes widened. William had a family. Then why didn't he ever go back to Margaret? The caretaker sighed. That's a question only she might have the answer to. I believe she lives not too far from here. If you want, I can give you the last address she mentioned. Kyle exchanged a look with Emily, who nodded. Yes, please. We need to speak with her. After writing down the address, they thanked the caretaker and headed back to the car. The drive to Lillian's home took them through winding streets lined with old trees, the kind of neighborhood that had history in its roots. They pulled up to a small but well-kept house with a front porch lined with potted plants. Emily took a deep breath before knocking on the door. A few moments later, it opened slightly, revealing a woman with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, flicked over them cautiously. Can I help you? Emily held up the note. Are you Lillian Townsend? Lillian's expression froze. Who are you? How do you know that name? Kyle stepped forward, his voice gentle. We found something. Something about William. We think you might want to see it. Lillian hesitated, then slowly opened the door wider. Come in. The inside of her home was cozy, filled with books and framed photographs. She led them to the living room, where she sat on the couch, watching them carefully. Now tell me, what is this about? Emily placed the box they had recovered on the coffee table. This belonged to Margaret Townsend. We found it buried behind our house, the house she once lived in. Lillian's breath hitched. Margaret, the woman my grandfather loved? Tyler leaned forward. You know about her? Lillian nodded. I found out a few years ago. My grandfather never talked much about his past. But after he passed, I started looking into our family history. I found records about his time in the war, and that's when I learned about Margaret. I wanted to know more, but there wasn't much to go on. Emily opened the box and carefully handed Lillian one of the letters William had written. These are the letters he sent her. She never stopped loving him. She buried these, maybe hoping he would find them someday. Lillian's hands trembled as she held the letter, her eyes scanning the faded ink. I had no idea. I always wondered why he never went back to her. Kyle sat forward. We think we know why. We traced his records and found out he was declared missing in action, but he survived. He spent years in a hospital in France. By the time he was recovered, Margaret had moved on. She believed he was gone forever. Lillian wiped at her eyes. He must have thought there was nothing left for him to return to. Tyler frowned. But he never forgot her. We found more things buried, like she was still waiting, hoping. Lillian exhaled, looking down at the letters. I've spent so much time trying to piece together his past. This is more than I ever hoped for. Emily smiled softly. It belongs to your family. Lillian looked up, her eyes shining. Thank you. This means everything. There was a moment of quiet before Lillian stood up, glancing toward a framed photo on the wall. Would you like to see a picture of him? Of William? They all nodded eagerly as Lillian retrieved an old album. She flipped through pages before landing on a black and white photograph. There he was, a young man in uniform, standing in front of a small home. His eyes, despite the faded quality of the image, were filled with warmth. Emily touched the locket at her neck. Margaret had this same picture in her locket. Lillian smiled. Then she always carried him with her, just like he carried her. Daisy, who had been lying quietly by their feet, let out a soft whine, as if sensing the emotions in the room. Tyler leaned down to scratch behind her ears. Looks like she knew this was the right path all along. Lillian reached out, giving the locket a gentle touch. I think I'd like to visit her grave. If there's a final piece to this story, it's there. Emily nodded. Then let's do it together. As they made plans for the visit, there was a sense of quiet closure settling around them. The past had found its way back to where it belonged, and for the first time, William and Margaret's story was whole again. But there was still more to uncover. And they weren't done just yet. The road leading to Margaret's final resting place was lined with towering oaks, their branches stretching toward the sky like silent witnesses to history. Emily drove carefully, glancing in the rearview mirror at Lillian, who sat quietly in the back seat, gazing out the window. She held William's letters in her lap, her fingers running over the faded paper, as though she could feel the past through the ink. Kyle sat beside Emily, navigating as they neared the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Tyler, nestled between Lillian and Daisy, stared down at the old photograph of William, committing every detail to memory. "Do you think she ever gave up hope?" he asked softly. Lillian exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't think so. If she had, she wouldn't have left these behind. She wanted him to find them." Emily pulled the car into the gravel lot, and they stepped out, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The cemetery was quiet, save for the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. Lillian clutched the box of letters tightly as they followed the caretaker's directions to Margaret's grave. When they reached it, a simple headstone marked her name, birth year, and the year she had passed. Fresh flowers lay at the base, and a gentle breeze carried the scent toward them. Lillian took a deep breath and knelt, her fingers tracing Margaret's name. "She was real," Lillian whispered. "She wasn't just some story in an old letter." Kyle crouched beside her. She lived a full life, but she never let go of William. Emily placed a comforting hand on Lillian's shoulder. "And now you're here. You're giving her story an ending she never got." Lillian pulled one of the letters from the box and set it gently on the grave. "She deserves to know what happened to him, even if it's just in spirit." Tyler glanced at Daisy, who sat attentively, her ears perked. "I think she knows." They stood in respectful silence, the weight of history settling over them. Then, as if on cue, Daisy stood and trotted toward a small path leading away from the cemetery. She stopped, turned back, and barked once. Emily frowned. "That's the same way she acted when we found the box." Kyle gave Lillian a questioning glance. "Do you want to see where she's leading us?" Lillian hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Let's follow her." They moved carefully through the tall grass, past the edges of the cemetery, and into a grove of trees. The path was overgrown, but not impassable. It seemed less like a random animal trail, and more like something once traveled, long ago. "Do you think Margaret used to come here?" Tyler asked, as he stepped over a fallen branch. Emily glanced around. "It's possible. Maybe it was a special place for her and William." Daisy stopped near a small clearing and sniffed at the ground. Lillian stepped closer, brushing away leaves and debris with her hands. Her breath caught when she found what was beneath them. An old wooden bench, nearly swallowed by time, sat against the trunk of a large oak tree. The initials MT plus WT were carved into the wood, faint but unmistakable. Lillian's fingers trembled as she traced the letters. This was their place. Kyle stepped back, giving her space. It must have meant something if she came here often enough to mark it. Emily's eyes softened. She never let go of him, even after he was gone. Lillian sat down on the weathered bench, taking in the quiet around her. I spent so much time wondering if he ever thought about her, if he missed her as much as she missed him. And now, I have my answer. They both held on to each other, even without knowing. Tyler sat beside her. Maybe this was her way of keeping him close. If she couldn't have him, at least she had this. Daisy circled the bench before settling at Lillian's feet. The dog let out a satisfied sigh, as if she knew her job was done. Lillian reached into the box, pulled out one of the photographs of Margaret, and set it beside the carved initials. She should have stayed here, with him. But at least now she's not forgotten. They lingered for a while, absorbing the quiet, until finally Lillian stood, brushing dirt from her hands. I think I'm ready to go. As they walked back to the car, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Emily looked back at the cemetery one last time. Margaret and William's story never got the ending they wanted, but I think they finally found peace. Lillian nodded. And thanks to you, I found them too. Daisy trotted ahead, leading them back the way they came, her tail wagging like she had known all along that this was where the journey needed to go. And maybe, in some way, she did. The drive back home was filled with a silence that wasn't empty, but full of thoughts, of memories that didn't belong to them, but had somehow become theirs to carry. Lillian sat in the back seat, staring at the photograph of Margaret she had taken from the bench. She ran her thumb over the image, as though she could bring her grandmother to life with the touch alone. Emily kept her eyes on the road, but every now and then she stole glances at Lillian in the rearview mirror. "How are you feeling?" she finally asked, breaking the stillness. Lillian exhaled. "Like I'm holding something that was never meant to be lost. I knew my grandfather had a life before the one he built with my grandmother, but I didn't know it was a love like this." Kyle shifted in his seat. "Do you think Margaret ever told anyone else about William?" Lillian shook her head. "I don't think so. If she did, the story never reached me, but it makes sense now. My father used to say that she always carried this quiet sadness with her, not enough to make her unhappy, but just enough that it was noticeable if you paid attention." Tyler, who had been staring out the window, turned to face her. "Do you think William ever remembered her, even if he didn't go back?" Lillian sighed. "I hope so. Maybe not right away. But eventually, I think he must have. Maybe in some small way, he knew there was someone out there he had once loved." Daisy let out a soft whimper from the back, shifting slightly in her spot, as if even she could feel the weight of the moment. Lillian reached down and stroked the dog's fur absent-mindedly. "She's the reason all of this happened, isn't she? She knew there was something we needed to find." Emily smiled. "She's got a way of sensing things. She led us here for a reason." Lillian looked out the window as the trees blurred past. "I don't want to leave this unfinished. Margaret's story deserves more than just an ending. It deserves a beginning, too. I want to know what happened to William in those missing years." Kyle nodded. "Then that's what we do next. We follow his trail. We know he made it back, we know he ended up in New York, but there's still a gap between when he was found and when he passed." Emily tapped the wheel. "If he was in a hospital for so long, there have to be medical records, maybe veterans' records too. We need to find out where he was treated." Lillian straightened. "I know someone who might be able to help. I have a friend who works with historical archives. She might be able to access records that aren't online." Kyle glanced at Emily. "Sounds like a good place to start." When they got back home, the first thing Lillian did was call her friend, Charlotte, explaining the situation in careful detail. Charlotte was quiet on the other end for a long moment before finally speaking. This is an incredible story. I can try to find what you need, but it might take time. Some of these records are restricted. Lillian nodded. Whatever you can find, it'll be worth the wait. Charlotte agreed to start searching immediately, and with that call, the next phase of their journey began. Days passed with little news, but Emily and Kyle continued piecing together what they could. Tyler took on his own research, diving into books about World War II veterans, displacement, and the psychological toll of losing one's identity. It fascinated him how one missing person's life could unravel a story spanning generations. Then, one afternoon, Lillian's phone rang. She answered on the first ring. "Charlotte? I found something." Charlotte's voice was filled with urgency. "It wasn't easy, but I located records from a hospital in France that match William Townsend's profile. He was admitted in 1944 under the category of severe memory loss due to combat trauma. He wasn't even listed under his real name at first. They gave him an identification number because he had no documents on him." Lillian's breath hitched. That's why it took him so long to get back. He didn't even know who he was. Charlotte continued. The hospital kept him for 5 years until 1950. After that, he was transferred to a rehabilitation center in England. That's when his records finally had his real name attached to them. Someone must have figured out who he was. Kyle, who was listening in, furrowed his brow. But who? Who identified him? Charlotte paused. That part I don't know yet, but I'm going to keep digging. What I did find, though, is that after he was released, he applied for a new passport. And guess what address he listed? Lillian's hands tightened around the phone. What? Charlotte took a breath. The old Townsend family house. He tried to go back. The room went silent. Emily's throat felt tight. But by then, Margaret had already left. She had already moved away. Charlotte confirmed. Exactly. He went looking, but he was too late. The house was under new ownership. Tyler spoke up. Then what did he do? Charlotte sighed. He moved to New York and started over. That's where his records go next. But the fact that he tried to go back means he did remember, at least some of it. And maybe he did love her just as much as she loved him. Lillian wiped at her eyes. We need to go to New York. If he tried to go home, maybe there's something there. Something that tells us what happened next. Emily met her gaze. Then that's our next step. We go to the house. We see what's left. Kyle nodded. And maybe, just maybe, we'll finally get the last piece of the puzzle. Daisy lifted her head, tail thumping against the floor, as if she knew. There was still more waiting to be found. The drive to New York was long, but no one seemed to mind. Lillian sat quietly in the back, flipping through the letters once more, absorbing each word like it was the first time she had read them. Tyler sat beside her, staring out the window, lost in thought. Daisy curled up in the back seat, tail occasionally thumping against the door. Emily gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing ahead. They were retracing William's steps, following the path he had taken when he tried to return home. What had he felt when he stood at that doorstep, only to realize Margaret was no longer there? Had he asked the new owners about her? Had he walked away with regret? Or had he already known deep down that too much time had passed? Kyle, sitting beside her, finally broke the silence. Do we even know if the house is still there? After all these years, someone else must have moved in. It could have been remodeled, torn down, anything. Lillian nodded. I checked public records before we left. The house still stands. It's been owned by the same family since the early 1960s. Tyler perked up. Then maybe they know something. Maybe the people who bought it after Margaret left found something. Letters, pictures, anything. Emily exhaled. We'll find out soon enough. They reached the quiet neighborhood in the late afternoon. The houses were well maintained, with neatly trimmed lawns and small gardens lining the sidewalks. Emily pulled the car up to the curb in front of the house that once belonged to William's family. It was a modest two-story home with faded blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked slightly in the breeze. Lillian hesitated before stepping out. This is it. This is where he tried to come back to. Tyler hopped out first, Daisy bounding after him. The golden retriever sniffed the air, her tail wagging as she made her way toward the front steps. Emily and Kyle followed behind, waiting as Lillian knocked on the door. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked at them curiously. "Can I help you?" Lillian took a deep breath. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am. My name is Lillian Townsend. My grandfather, William Townsend, used to live here many years ago. We were wondering if we could ask you some questions about the house and its history." The woman's face shifted, her eyes widening slightly. "William Townsend," she murmured, as if testing the name on her tongue. "Please, come in." They stepped inside, the house warm and welcoming. The woman led them into the living room, where framed photographs lined the fireplace mantel. She gestured for them to sit. "My name is Helen Parker. My husband and I bought this house in 1961. Before that, it belonged to another family, but we never knew much about its previous owners." Lillian leaned forward. "We recently found letters that my grandfather wrote to a woman named Margaret. He tried to come back here after the war, but by then she was already gone. We were hoping there might be something, anything, that could tell us more about what happened to him after that." Helen pursed her lips. "That's quite a story. I don't know much about William Townsend, but when we first moved in, we did find some things hidden in the attic. Old letters, a photograph or two. We never knew who they belonged to, so we just boxed them up and left them there." Lillian's breath caught. "You still have them?" Helen nodded. "I believe so. Give me a moment." She disappeared down the hall, returning a few minutes later with a dust-covered shoebox. Setting it on the coffee table, she lifted the lid, revealing a bundle of aged papers, tied together with string. Atop them lay a single black and white photograph. Lillian reached for it with trembling fingers. It was William. Older than he had been in the other pictures, but still unmistakably him. He stood in front of the house, looking right at the camera, a solemn expression on his face. Emily leaned in. This must have been taken when he came back, when he realized Margaret wasn't here. Lillian's eyes welled up as she turned over the photograph. There was something written on the back in faded ink. "I made it back, but she's gone. Do you tea?" Kyle let out a slow breath. He did remember. He knew he had someone to come back to. Helen wiped her hands on her apron. "There's more in the box. Letters he wrote, but never sent. I suppose he didn't have anyone to send them to anymore." Lillian carefully untied the bundle, unfolding the top letter. She began reading aloud, her voice shaking. "Margaret, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I had to write it. I made it home, but the house wasn't ours anymore. I asked around, but no one knew where you had gone. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe life moved on for both of us. But I need you to know that I came back. I remembered you. Even when I didn't know my own name, I remembered you. And I will keep remembering. W.T." Tears slipped down Lillian's cheeks. He never forgot her. He never stopped loving her. Helen reached over and patted her hand gently. Love like that doesn't just disappear. It lingers, even when time tries to erase it. Tyler looked at the letters, his face set with determination. "We need to take these back to Margaret's grave. She needs to have them. Emily nodded. And then we need to finish the rest of his story. We know he stayed in New York, but we don't know what happened after that. We have to find out. Lillian smiled through her tears. Then we keep going. For them. As they packed up the letters and the photograph, Daisy nudged Lillian's hand, her tail wagging softly. It was as if she, too, knew they were on the right path. And somehow, in that quiet moment, it felt like William and Margaret were right there with them, guiding them to where the story would finally be complete. The drive back was quiet, the shoebox full of letters sitting on Lillian's lap as she stared out the window, lost in thought. Emily glanced at her every so often, wondering what she was thinking, wondering if Lillian felt the same pull that had been gnawing at her since they started this journey. Kyle focused on the road, and Tyler rested his head against the window, one hand on Daisy's head. The dog lay curled up between him and Lillian, her tail occasionally thumping as if she knew they were still on a mission. When they arrived home, the first thing Lillian did was spread the letters out on the kitchen table, carefully laying each one flat, smoothing the edges with her fingertips. She didn't speak, and no one pressed her to. The room was filled with a reverent silence, as though they were in the presence of something sacred. Tyler sat beside her, reading over her shoulder while Kyle and Emily stood back, letting her have her moment. After a long stretch of silence, Lillian looked up. "We need to take these back to Margaret's grave." Emily nodded. "We can do that. Tomorrow morning?" Lillian smiled faintly. "Yeah, tomorrow." They spent the rest of the evening reading the letters, piecing together William's thoughts, his regrets, and his enduring love for Margaret. Each letter was a small window into his heart, revealing the depths of his longing and the pain of losing her. There were lines that brought tears to their eyes, and others that made them smile, as if William was right there with them, telling his story. In one letter, he described a dream he had of Margaret, sitting on a porch swing, her laughter ringing out like music. In another, he wrote about the quiet evenings in the hospital when he would stare at the ceiling, trying to remember her face. Each word felt like a thread, weaving the tapestry of their love, their loss, and the decades that had passed since. The next morning, they packed the letters carefully back into the box and set out for the cemetery. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue streaked with wispy clouds. They walked the familiar path to Margaret's grave, the shoebox held close to Lillian's chest. When they reached the headstone, Lillian knelt down, placing the box gently at the base. "These belong to you," she whispered. "He never stopped loving you, and now you can have his words." Emily stepped forward and placed a small bouquet of daisies beside the box. Kyle and Tyler stood behind them, the weight of the moment settling over them like a blanket. After a long silence, Tyler spoke. "Do you think she knows?" Lillian looked up at him, her eyes soft. "I think she does." They stayed for a while, sharing memories of what they'd learned about Margaret and William, imagining what their life could have been if things had turned out differently. But even in the sadness, there was a sense of peace, as if they had done something important, something that mattered. When they finally walked back to the car, Daisy trotted ahead, her tail wagging. It felt like the end of one chapter, but not the story. There was still more to learn, more to discover, and they knew they weren't done yet. Back home, they settled in the living room, the letters now safely returned to their rightful place. Lillian took a deep breath and looked at Emily and Kyle. "I need to know more about what happened to William after he moved to New York. He lived there for years. There must be something. Friends, neighbors, maybe even a diary. Kyle nodded. We can start looking into local records. And maybe Charlotte can help again. Lillian smiled. I'll call her tomorrow. The next few days were spent digging through archives, both online and at the local library. They found records of William working as a carpenter in a small town just outside Albany. They discovered that he had joined a local veterans group where he had given a few speeches about his time in the war. There were newspaper clippings mentioning his name, brief mentions that painted a picture of a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, but was respected by those who knew him. One article stood out. A photograph of William at a veterans event, shaking hands with a younger man. The caption read, "Local hero William Townsend shares his experiences with the next generation." Lillian stared at the photograph, her heart aching. He did his best, didn't he? He couldn't go back to Margaret, but he still lived a good life. Emily sat beside her. He honored her memory in his own way. He never forgot her, but he also tried to move forward. Tyler pointed at the article. Do you think anyone at the veterans group still remembers him? Kyle rubbed his chin. It's worth a shot. If anyone knew him, they might have stories or letters. Lillian nodded. Then that's what we do next. They reached out to the veterans group, now run by a younger generation, but still maintaining records and photographs from decades past. The current coordinator, a woman named Sarah, was eager to help. She invited them to visit the small office where they kept their archives. When they arrived, Sarah greeted them warmly. She led them to a room lined with filing cabinets and shelves filled with old scrapbooks and framed photographs. William Townsend was one of our most beloved members, she said, pulling out a large scrapbook. He used to sit right over there, by the window, and tell stories to anyone who'd listen. Lillian ran her fingers over the scrapbook's cover. What kinds of stories did he tell? Sarah smiled. He talked about his time in the war, of course, but he also talked about the people he loved. He never mentioned names, but it was clear there was someone he had lost. He once said, I carried her in my heart all my life. I always wondered who he was talking about. Lillian opened the scrapbook, flipping through pages filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. One note caught her eye, written in William's familiar handwriting. To the one I lost, but never let go. I hope you found peace as I try to find mine. She traced the words with her fingertips, tears filling her eyes. Even here, he never forgot her. Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder. William Townsend was a man who loved deeply. I think he would be glad to know someone found these, that someone still cares. Lillian looked up. He deserves to be remembered. They both do. Emily, Kyle, and Tyler stood behind her, sharing in the moment. It felt like they were closer than ever to understanding William's journey, to piecing together the life he built after losing Margaret. When they left the veterans group that day, they carried with them not just the scrapbook, but the knowledge that William had continued to love and remember Margaret, even as he built a new life. The story wasn't over yet, but they knew they were on the right path. As they drove back home, Daisy rested her head on Lillian's lap, her tail wagging softly. It felt like a sign that they were getting closer, that the pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together. And they knew they would keep going until the story was complete. The quiet hum of the car filled the space as they drove back from the veterans group. Lillian sat in the back seat, her fingers brushing the edges of the scrapbook now resting on her lap. She'd gone through every page at least twice during the ride, as though each new glance might reveal a hidden detail. The clippings and photographs were fragile, but well preserved, and they painted a picture of William's later years that was both comforting and bittersweet. Daisy lay stretched out at her feet, her tail occasionally wagging as if she sensed the importance of what they'd found. Emily glanced at Lillian through the rearview mirror, her expression thoughtful. Kyle sat beside her, flipping through notes on his phone about the next steps in their search. "So, he stayed in the same town until he passed," Lillian murmured, her eyes on the scrapbook. "But why did he never try again? To find Margaret, I mean. He went back to the house once. Maybe he thought it was enough." Emily nodded slowly. He might have believed he missed his chance. He probably thought Margaret had moved on, maybe even remarried. "But she hadn't," Tyler pointed out. "She waited." Lillian looked out the window, her expression heavy. "And he didn't know. That's the part that hurts. He didn't know she was still waiting." Kyle cleared his throat. "Well, we know a lot more than we did when we started. He came back, he tried to find her, and then he built a life. Maybe it wasn't the one he planned, but he made a difference. Those veterans he mentored, he left his mark." Lillian nodded. "That's true. And maybe that was enough for him." Emily pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. They all stepped out, and Daisy trotted ahead to the front door, her tail wagging. The house felt quiet when they walked in, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of quiet that allowed their thoughts to settle and their emotions to catch up. Lillian set the scrapbook on the kitchen table, her fingers still lingering on the cover. "I think we've done what we can for now." Emily nodded. "It feels like the right time to pause, at least for a little while." Kyle glanced at Tyler. "You've been keeping track of all this, right?" Tyler grinned. "I've got a whole journal full of notes. Dates, places, what we found, everything." Lillian smiled at him. "Good. It's important to keep it all straight. Someday someone else might want to know this story." As they sat around the table, the weight of the journey seemed to lift slightly. They had uncovered so much, pieced together lives that had been hidden for decades. Yet there was still more to learn, and they all knew deep down that they wouldn't stop until they'd found every piece of the puzzle. Daisy barked once, her tail wagging as she looked at them expectantly, as if to say the work wasn't quite done yet. Lillian chuckled, reaching down to pet her. "You've been the best guide through all of this," she said softly. "You knew from the start, didn't you?" The golden retriever wagged her tail harder, her eyes bright. Emily reached over and touched Lillian's hand. "Whenever you're ready, we'll take the next step." Lillian smiled, a hint of determination returning to her expression. "I'll let you know when it's time." Over the next few weeks, Lillian found herself drawn back to the scrapbook, flipping through its pages in the quiet hours of the morning. She would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the early light streaming through the window, and immerse herself in the fragments of William's life. Each photograph, each newspaper clipping felt like a conversation with the past, as though she was learning to know him in ways she never had before. One particular morning, Tyler joined her at the table, his own notebook in hand. "I was thinking," he began, "if we could find out more about his friends at the veterans group, we might learn things that aren't in these letters." Lillian nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good idea. The letters tell us how he felt, but his friends might know what he didn't say." Tyler flipped open his notebook, revealing a list of names they had come across in the veterans group records. "I wrote these down when we visited the office. Some of them were mentioned more than once, like Harold Thompson and James Miller. They might still have family around here." Lillian smiled at him. "You've done a great job with all this. I'm proud of you." Tyler beamed. "I just want to help. It feels like we're bringing something important back to life." Together, They decided to start making calls. It wasn't easy, and many of the numbers they found were outdated or disconnected. But after a few days of persistence, they finally reached someone who remembered Harold Thompson's family. His granddaughter, Sarah, still lived in the area and agreed to meet with them. They arranged to meet Sarah at a local coffee shop. She was a young woman in her early 30s, with a warm smile and a curious glint in her eyes. She listened intently as Lillian and Tyler explained their search for information about William. "My grandfather used to talk about Mr. Townsend all the time," Sarah said. "He said Mr. Townsend was like a mentor to him. I remember him saying that even though Mr. Townsend was quiet, you could tell he carried something in his heart." Lillian leaned forward. "Did he ever say what that was?" Sarah shook her head. "Not exactly, but once, when I was little, I asked him why Mr. Townsend always seemed so serious. He told me it was because Mr. Townsend had lost something very precious to him. At the time, I thought he meant something physical, like a keepsake. But now I wonder if he meant someone." Tyler glanced at Lillian, his eyes wide. "Margaret," he whispered. Sarah continued. "My grandfather also said that Mr. Townsend was one of the kindest people he'd ever known. He helped so many of the younger veterans, made them feel like they weren't alone. Even though he didn't talk much about himself, everyone respected him." Lillian smiled softly. "It sounds like he found a way to give back, even though he carried that pain." As they left the coffee shop, Lillian felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were getting closer, not just to William's story, but to understanding the full measure of his character. The more they learned, the more she felt that his love for Margaret had never diminished. It had shaped the man he became, even in her absence. Back at home, Emily and Kyle had been busy contacting libraries and local archives, looking for any additional records or personal accounts. They found a collection of oral histories from the Veterans Group, recorded decades earlier. In one interview, Harold Thompson described a memory of William. "Mr. Townsend never talked about his personal life much," Harold said in the recording. "But one evening, after a meeting, he stayed behind and told me something I never forgot. He said, 'There's someone I wish I could see again, but I lost her a long time ago. Sometimes I think it's the not knowing that's hardest.'" Lillian listened to the recording, her chest tightening. "He missed her every day," she said quietly. Kyle put a hand on her shoulder. "But he kept her with him. That's something, isn't it?" Lillian nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "It is. And now we know he never truly let her go." Over the next week, they compiled everything they had learned, letters, photographs, recorded memories, into a single binder. It felt like creating a living memory, a tribute to a love that had endured despite the odds. The more they pieced together, the more they realized how much William and Margaret's story had touched not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who had crossed paths with them. As Lillian flipped through the binder one last time, she looked over at Daisy, who sat at her feet, watching her with those knowing eyes. "We've come so far," she said softly. "And I think William and Margaret would be proud of what we've done." Daisy wagged her tail, as if agreeing. Lillian smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. "We're not finished yet, but we're closer than ever." The journey that had begun with Daisy's insistent barking at an empty field now brought Lillian, Emily, Kyle, and Tyler to the final stretch. Over the weeks, they had poured through letters, photographs, and personal accounts, slowly piecing together William and Margaret's love story. The box of mementos was no longer just a collection of aged papers. It had become the heart of a narrative that spanned decades and connected generations. Lillian held on to that heart with quiet reverence as they prepared to take one last trip. Margaret's grave, resting under the gentle shade of an old oak tree, had become a sacred place. The headstone was simple, bearing only her name and dates. Yet, it had drawn them back time and time again. It was here they had brought William's letters, and it was here that Lillian hoped to find closure. Not an end to the story, but a piece that would allow her to carry their legacy forward. As the family stepped out of the car, Daisy trotted ahead, her tail wagging steadily. The golden retriever paused at the path leading to the cemetery, her nose high in the air. It was as if Daisy knew this visit would be different, as if she sensed they were not just visiting the past, but finally connecting it to the present. They approached Margaret's headstone in a silence that spoke louder than any words. Lillian carried the scrapbook in her arms, the binder tucked under one elbow. She paused for a moment, looking at the grave, before kneeling on the soft grass. She placed the scrapbook and binder carefully at the base of the headstone. "These belong here," Lillian said quietly. "They were always yours." Emily knelt beside her, gently touching the edge of the scrapbook. "It's been a long journey, hasn't it?" Lillian nodded. "It has. But it's been worth it." Tyler crouched down next to Daisy, who had settled onto the grass, her tail still wagging. "Do you think they're together now? Margaret and William?" Lillian smiled softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "I think they've always been together. Even when they were apart, their love never faded." Kyle placed a hand on Lillian's shoulder. "You've done something amazing, bringing their story back to life." Lillian glanced at him. "We all did. I couldn't have done it alone." The family sat there for a while, sharing quiet reflections about the journey they'd taken and the people they'd come to know through the fragments of history. They talked about William's letters, his time at the veterans group, and the way he had carried Margaret in his heart for all those years. Each memory was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of a love that had endured across time. Daisy rose to her feet, walking a few steps away before looking back at them, her tail wagging gently. Lillian stood and smiled at the dog. "It's time, isn't it, girl?" Emily and Kyle exchanged a glance, and Emily nodded. "I think it is." They took their time leaving the cemetery, stopping once to look back at the grave. Lillian felt a sense of peace settling over her. The weight of not knowing, of unfinished stories, was no longer there. She knew there were still questions they'd never be able to answer, but that was okay. What mattered was that William and Margaret's love had not been lost to time. It had been found, remembered, and cherished once more. When they reached the car, Lillian took one last look at the cemetery. "Thank you," she said softly, as if speaking to Margaret and William directly. "For everything." As they drove away, Daisy leaned against Lillian's legs, her warm presence a reminder of how it had all begun. Lillian scratched behind the dog's ears and whispered, "You're the reason we found them. You knew what we needed to see, even when we didn't." Daisy's tail wagged, and Lillian smiled, her heart full. At home, they placed the scrapbook and binder in a special spot on the bookshelf, a quiet tribute to the journey they had taken and the lives they had touched. As the days passed, the family found that William and Margaret's story continued to inspire them. It was not just a tale of love lost and found. It was a reminder of the enduring power of connection, of memory, and of hope. Emily often thought back to the mornings they spent reading William's letters, the way his words had painted a vivid picture of a man who never stopped loving, never stopped hoping. Kyle found himself reflecting on the strength it must have taken for Margaret to keep waiting, to never let go of the man she loved, even when it seemed impossible. And Lillian, each time she glanced at the scrapbook, felt a deep gratitude for the chance to learn about the grandparents she had never truly known. Their story had become her story, a part of who she was. It reminded her to cherish the connections she had, to hold on to the people she loved, and to never underestimate the impact of a love that endures. Daisy continued to be a constant presence, her wagging tail and joyful spirit a reminder that sometimes, even when the past feels far away, there are signs and moments that can guide us back. She became more than just a dog. She was the thread that tied the family's journey together, the one who had led them to the field, to the box, and ultimately to the discovery of a love story that would live on in their hearts. In the end, the story of William and Margaret was not just about what had been lost, but about what had been found. It was a story of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of love. And as Lillian and her family moved forward, they carried that story with them, a shining reminder that even after so many years, love could still bring people together, heal old wounds, and light the way forward.